welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack some really insightful research on how environmental factors before birth might influence the risk for autism spectrum disorder, or ASD.
Yeah, and we're looking at a very significant source for this. It's a recent review article published in BMC Medicine, late 2024.
Right. It's called Prenatal Environmental Risk Factors for Autism Spectrum Disorder and Their Potential Mechanisms.
Exactly.
And this isn't going to be just, a quick skim of the headlines. We're really going to dig into what scientists are learning about how the mother's environment during pregnancy could play a critical role.
Working hand in hand with a child's genetic makeup.
It's all about understanding that really complex picture behind, well, why we seem to be seeing increased ASD diagnoses.
Absolutely. And this review specifically tries to pull together evidence on factors in that prenatal environment that could potentially be modified.
Things we could maybe do something about.
Potentially, yeah. And critically, how they might biologically affect a developing fetus. So the mechanisms involved.
Okay, let's dive right into this review then. See what surprising facts and key insights really stand out.
Sound good.
So first, maybe let's set the stage. How does this source describe ASD itself?
Well, it's described, as a neurodevelopmental condition.
Okay.
Characterized by differences in social communication and interaction, and often repetitive behaviors or sort of restricted interests.
And typically identified pretty early, right, in childhood?
Yeah, usually in early childhood when these developmental patterns become more noticeable.
And the stats cited in the review, what do they say about prevalence?
They give a global estimate of about 10 per 4,000 children and adults, looking at data from 2012 to 2022.
Okay, 1 in 100 roughly.
And as is pretty widely known, it's significantly more common in males. The figure they cite is about 4.2 times more likely than in females.
Right, and the review sees it as complex, yeah.
Oh, definitely. The understanding now is that ASD isn't caused by one single thing.
Okay.
It's multifactorial, meaning it involves a mix, inherited genetics, contributions from the environment, especially the maternal environment during pregnancy, and then how those genes and the environment actually interact with each other.
And this review is really honing in on that environmental piece.
Exactly. Specifically, the potentially modifiable factors during that prenatal window.
Things that, if we understood them better, maybe we could actually influence.
That's the idea. Because while things like broader diagnostic criteria and just more awareness definitely explain part of the rise in reported diagnoses, this review suggests that the interplay between genetic predisposition and, modern environmental exposures is likely driving a true increase, an actual increase in the number of children born with ASD.
Okay, so genetics is kind of the backdrop here.
Right.
The review touches on that strong genetic component, family history, twin studies showing high heritability. What was the estimate? Around 50%.
Yeah, around 50%. Genetics definitely provides the foundation, making someone potentially more or less susceptible. And it's thought that certain genetic variations might make an individual more vulnerable to the very biological disruptions the review talks about.
Like inflammation or issues with how cells make energy, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Like the genetic wiring might sort of set the sensitivity level for those environmental inputs.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And given how diverse ASD is, how it presents so differently in different people, understanding this interaction is really key to figuring out how environmental factors might push development down a different path during those critical stages in the womb.
Right. So, okay, what are these key prenatal environmental factors that the review gets into?
They group them into several main categories. There's infections during pregnancy,
Okay.
maternal obesity and gestational diabetes, or GDM, maternal use of certain medications. They focus on SSRIs and antibiotics,
Right.
and then exposure to various toxins in the environment.
And the review suggests these different factors might actually work through kind of similar pathways in the developing fetus.
Yes, and that's where it gets really fascinating. It's still being heavily explored, of course, especially in lab and animal studies.
Sure.
But the suspected biological pathways involve things like immune system dysregulation, basically, the body's defense system acting up or acting differently.
Okay.
Problems with cellular energy production, so mitochondrial dysfunction, oxidative stress, changes to the gut microbiome, and disruptions in hormones.
Wow, okay. It's pretty striking how these seemingly really different external things, infection, diet, chemicals, could all converge on just a few core biological system.
It really is.
So let's maybe take them one by one, starting with infections during pregnancy.
Okay. Well, the epidemiological evidence, looking at populations, consistently links various maternal infections to an increased likelihood of ASD. They mention older examples like rubella, cytomegalovirus.
Right, those are known teratogens. What about more recent studies?
They highlight a large Danish study found that severe viral infections, things like influenza, gastroenteritis, that actually required hospitalization in the first trimester, were linked to a pretty significant 2.8 times increased risk of ASD.
Wow, almost 3 times the risk just from a severe viral infection early on. That really does jump out.
It does, and bacterial infections later in pregnancy in the second trimester showed about a 1.4 times increase.
Still notable.
Yeah, and even just having a fever during pregnancy was associated with a 2.1 times increase in one analysis. Interestingly, they note this might be modified by using fever reducers like antipyretics. And a meta-analysis, combining many studies, also found a general link between any maternal infection or fever and about a 1.3 times increased likelihood of ASD.
Okay, so the link seems pretty consistent across different studies. How do scientists think an infection or a fever in the mother might actually lead to increased ASD risk? What's the proposed biological mechanism there?
So the leading hypothesis involves something called maternal immune activation, or MIA. Right. So when a mother gets an infection or just has a strong inflammatory response for another reason, her immune system releases these signaling molecules. They're called cytokines. And the placenta itself can also get involved, releasing its own signals. These inflammatory signals can cross the placenta or influence the fetal environment in other ways and potentially disrupt how the brain is developing.
So it might not be the germ itself necessarily, but the mother's response to it, that inflammation.
That's the core idea behind MIA, yes. The review points to specific cytokines like IL-6 and IL-17A.
Okay.
And studies in mouse models are pretty compelling here. They show that inducing MIA in pregnant mice can cause ASD-like behaviors in their offspring.
Really?
Yeah, and if they block the action of certain cytokines like IL-17 or IL-6, it can actually prevent some of those effects.
Wow.
They even note findings of increased expression of the IL-6 gene in post-mortem brain tissue from individuals with autism.
That sounds like a pretty strong hint that inflammation isn't just correlated, but might actually be on the causal pathway.
It's certainly a major focus of research, absolutely.
Does the review mention other mechanisms related to infection?
It does. It also touches on how inflammation might affect mitochondria.
Oh, the energy factories in the cells.
Exactly. Mitochondria are quite sensitive to immune changes, and immune responses, like MIA, can disrupt how mitochondria produce energy. This has been seen in preclinical studies like using bacterial components, LPS, increases reactive oxygen species, a sign of stress, and reprograms metabolism in immune cells like microglia in the brain.
And is there a human link to this mitochondrial idea in ASD?
There is some evidence. The review mentions human postmortem studies and also PE scans suggesting reduced mitochondrial gene expression or maybe lower function in the brains of some individuals with ASD.
Yeah.
And sometimes this correlates with the degree of social communication challenges, at least in the males studied. But the specific chain linking maternal infection to fetal mitochondrial dysfunction and then directly to ASD in humans, that's still being pieced together, needs more work.
Got it. And what about the gut microbiome? We hear so much about the gut-brain axis. Does that play a role here with infection?
It's definitely being explored, though mostly in animal models so far for this specific link. The idea is that changes in the mother's gut bacteria might mediate some of the effects of infection.
How would that work?
Well, mouse studies show that MIA can alter the offspring's gut microbiome composition, and it can also make the gut lining more permeable or leaky.
Okay.
And here's a really surprising finding from one mouse model. Giving a specific type of gut bacteria, Bacteroides fragilis, to the pups born after MIA actually improved their ASD-like behavior.
Wow. Treating the pup's gut bacteria could reverse some effects.
Yeah.
That's fascinating evidence for the gut-brain link.
It is, isn't it? Though, again, the direct line from maternal infection to maternal gut changes to fetal effects leading to ASD in humans. That chain still needs much more research to confirm. And the review points out challenges like, accurately validating infection details in large studies and separating the effect of the pathogen itself versus the inflammation it causes.
And by disentangling all that is tricky. Okay, let's move on to metabolic health. The review discusses maternal obesity and gestational diabetes, GDM.
Yes, another major area. Multiple studies link these conditions to an increased likelihood of ASD.
How strong are the links?
Well, pre-pregnancy obesity is associated with roughly a 1.3 to 2.0 times increase in risk.
Okay.
And even gaining excessive weight during pregnancy is linked to maybe a 1.1 to 1.6 times increase.
And GDM, gestational diabetes.
A meta-analysis looking across studies found GDM associated with about a 1.5 to 1.7 times increased risk.
Similar range then.
Yeah. And there's some suggestion the timing might also matter, with an earlier diagnosis of GDM perhaps being linked to a higher risk.
So what's the connection here? How might obesity or diabetes in the mother influence the fetus's developing brain? Is it inflammation again?
Inflammation seems to be a really key player here too, yes. Both obesity and GDM are considered states of chronic low-grade inflammation.
Ah, okay. So it's a similar theme to the infections.
It really appears to be a key overlapping pathway. This systemic inflammation can lead to the release of those pro-inflammatory cytokines we mentioned, IL-1, TNFS, IL-6, which can cross the placenta and potentially affect fetal neurodevelopment based on rodent models.
So inflammation is a common thread. What else?
There's also the hormonal angle. Obesity and GDM disrupt metabolic hormones like insulin and leptin. These are crucial for growth and development, but they also interact with the immune system.
Right.
And this kind of hormonal dysregulation can be transmitted, in a sense, to the fetus.
And the review mentioned something about potential sex-specific responses in the placenta.
Yes, which could be important in trying to understand the higher prevalence of ASD in males. The placenta might react differently to these metabolic challenges depending on fetal sex.
Interesting. Does the gut microbiome pop up here too?
It does, yes. Obesity and GDM are known to alter the mother's gut microbiota composition, and they can also affect the integrity of the gut barrier.
The leaky gut idea again.
Kind of, yeah. And this could potentially lead to bacterial products, like LPS, getting into the mother's circulation and reaching the placenta.
And those products could influence development.
Potentially, yes. Or changes in beneficial bacterial byproducts. The review mentions studies on short-chain fatty acids, or SCFAs, which are produced by gut bacteria.
Right.
The picture here is a bit complex. In mice, one SCFA, propionic acid, seemed to induce ASD-like behaviors, but another one, sodium butyrate, seemed to alleviate them.
So opposite effects.
Yeah. And SCFAs were also shown to prevent placental growth inhibition in one mouse model. There's also a link noted between hyperglycemia, high blood sugar, in mothers with type 1 diabetes, and offspring ASD-like behaviors in rats, which could be mitigated by insulin treatment.
So managing blood sugar seems key.
It likely is. But it sounds like another area where figuring out the exact cause and effect is really tough, especially since obesity and GDM often happen together, right?
Definitely. They share many underlying features, like that inflammation piece.
Exactly. And the review points out challenges like variations in how obesity and GDM are defined across studies, but it does suggest potential future interventions, like maybe dietary changes aimed at improving maternal gut health, could be a possible prevention strategy worth exploring.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's switch gears to medications. The review looks at maternal SSRI use during pregnancy. SSRIs being common antidepressants.
Right, and epidemiological studies have shown an association here, reporting somewhere between a 1.5 to maybe 4.5 times increased risk of ASD in offspring.
That sounds like quite a significant link, at least on the surface.
It does, but, and this is a really crucial point, the review emphasizes this association often gets much weaker, it's attenuated, when researchers carefully account for the mother's underlying psychiatric condition, like depression or anxiety.
Attenuated, meaning the link shrinks or even disappears.
Exactly. It strongly suggests something called confounding by indication. Meaning the underlying condition that the medication is being used to treat might be the actual factor driving the increased risk rather than the SSRI medication itself.
Ah, okay, so it might be the depression, not the antidepressant.
That's a major possibility. And the review notes a really perplexing finding where even preconception-only SSRI using it before pregnancy but not during was associated with risk in some studies.
That is weird, given how quickly most SSRIs leave the body, except maybe fluoxetine.
Right. It's hard to explain by the drug's presence if it's only used before conception, unless, as you hinted, the underlying condition was present before and continued into pregnancy, whether medication was used during pregnancy or not.
Makes sense. So the review is pretty cautious about drawing conclusions here.
Very cautious. It stresses that isolating the direct effect of the SSRI from the impact of the maternal mental health condition itself is incredibly challenging in these observational studies.
But if there were a direct effect, just hypothetically, what might be the biological mechanism?
Well, the primary hypothesis involves the fetal serotonin system. SSRIs work by affecting serotonin levels in the brain.
And serotonin is important for brain development.
Absolutely crucial. And interestingly, many individuals with ASD have been found to have elevated levels of serotonin in their whole blood. It's one of the most consistent biological findings, though its meaning isn't fully clear.
Huh.
So the idea is that high maternal serotonin, potentially from SSRI use, could theoretically disrupt the very delicate balance of serotonin signaling needed for the fetal brain to develop properly.
Okay, that makes biological sense as a potential pathway at least.
It does. Preclinical studies also hint that SSRIs might affect mitochondrial function, but the review notes there's really very little human data on that specific link.
And the gut microbiome, does it show up again?
It does indeed,
Hmm.
because gut microbes are actually involved in producing a lot of the body's serotonin precursors.
Right.
Yeah. So the thinking is that SSRI-induced changes in the mother's gut bacteria might indirectly influence those serotonin signaling pathways that could be relevant to ASD development.
Wow. It's just a reminder of how interconnected everything is in the body, isn't it? You've got the medication, the mother's underlying condition, maybe effects on mitochondria, maybe effects mediated by gut bacteria changing serotonin.
It really highlights the complexity researchers are grappling with when looking at these large population studies. It's rarely simple.
Okay, how about maternal antibiotic use during pregnancy? Is it a similar story to SSRIs?
Somewhat similar, yes. Again, some epidemiological studies have reported an association, maybe a 1.1 to 1.5 times increased likelihood of ASD.
Show smaller potential effect size than initially reported for SSRIs.
Generally, yes. But again, the review really stresses that these findings often get attenuated or weakened when researchers control for the underlying infection that the antibiotic is treating.
Right, confounding by indication again.
Exactly. Or when they use designs like comparing siblings within the same family, that helps account for shared genetic factors or shared home environments that might confound the results.
So like with SSRIs, it might be the underlying reason for taking the drug, the infection that's the bigger player, rather than the antibiotic itself.
That seems to be a very significant factor contributing to the association seen in some studies, yes.
Did the review mention any other interesting findings related to antibiotics?
Well, there was one rather counterintuitive finding mentioned. In one study, women who used antibiotics during pregnancy, having influenza in the second trimester wasn't linked to ASD risk. But in women who didn't use antibiotics, influenza was linked to a higher risk.
Huh. That suggests antibiotics might somehow modify the effect of the infection. That seems backwards from what you might expect.
It does seem a bit paradoxical, doesn't it? The review just notes it as an interesting finding that needs more research to understand what might be going on there.
Okay, so if antibiotics do have some direct effect separate from the infection, what's the proposed mechanism? Is it the microbiome again?
Primarily, yes. Disrupting the maternal gut microbiome is the main hypothesis.
How?
Well, antibiotics, especially broad-spectrum ones, can wipe out lots of bacteria, both good and bad. This can alter the overall community and potentially increase gut permeability, that leaky gut idea again,
Right.
which could then allow bacterial components or byproducts to cross into the mother system, potentially impacting fetal immunity. Or it could lead to changes in those gut-produced SCFAs we talked about, which might influence gene expression patterns epigenetically.
And have mouse studies looked at this?
Yes, there are mouse models showing that antibiotic use can alter how offspring behave after maternal immune activation, suggesting an interaction.
But does it line up with the human data?
That's where it gets complicated. The review notes that how we use antibiotics in human-specific types, doses, durations is very different from how they're often used experimentally in mice. So direct translation is challenging. And actually, in one mouse study mentioned, an antibiotic given during MIA actually seemed to prevent some of the ASD-like behaviors in the offspring.
So the opposite of what some human observational studies might suggest.
Exactly, which really underscores the difficulty in interpreting these links and the differences between controlled experiments and real-world human exposures.
Yeah, it seems preclinical models are great for testing specific ideas about mechanisms, but they don't always perfectly mirror what happens in complex human situations.
Precisely. A necessary tool, but you have to be cautious translating findings.
Okay, the last major category in the review is maternal exposure to toxicants, environmental chemicals.
Yes, and this is described as a really growing area of research. They look at chemicals that are pretty common in our environment.
Like what?
Things like phthalates, which are found in many plastics, cosmetics, personal care products, also air pollutants, and heavy
Yeah,
metals.
another links found.
There are emerging associations, yes. For phthalates, some studies measuring levels in prenatal urine have linked higher exposure to higher ASD symptom scores in the children later on.
Hmm. And air pollution.
Air pollution is also associated with increased risk. Some studies conducted in areas with high pollution showed maybe a 2.2 to 3.6 times higher risk. A meta-analysis combining studies found about a 1.4 times increased risk overall associated with certain air pollutants.
Those air pollution numbers are pretty striking, especially the higher end ones.
They are concerning, yeah. And for heavy metals, things like cadmium and cesium were linked to about a 1.8 times increase in ASD risk in one meta-analysis.
Okay.
And other studies have found higher concentrations of lead and mercury in autistic individuals compared to non-autistic peers, although measuring past exposure is tricky.
What about pesticides?
Evidence there is still emerging and seems more variable across different studies, but it's definitely an area of active investigation.
So how might these very different chemicals potentially increase risk? What are the suspected mechanisms?
The review suggests that toxicants often don't act alone. They might act synergistically, and they can disrupt several biological systems, like disrupting endocrine systems or hormones, increasing inflammation, and causing oxidative stress, which is basically damage from unstable molecules in our cells.
And disrupting hormones could be particularly relevant given the sex difference in ASD, right?
Exactly. That's a key hypothesis. For example, some phthalates are known endocrine disruptors and might interfere with testosterone activity, which is really crucial for typical male brain development.
So these chemicals could be messing with the very hormonal signals that help differentiate male and female brain wiring during fetal development.
That's definitely one leading idea. The review mentions research on BPA, another common chemical, found in plastics and can linings, potentially increasing male risk by affecting how a specific gene involved in estrogen production, the aromatase gene, works in the brain, potentially through epigenetic changes like methylation.
Wow, okay, so very specific molecular mechanisms being explored.
Yes. And toxicants might also affect metabolism. Higher phthalate levels were linked to ASD symptoms, potentially mediated by shifts in how cells produce energy during pregnancy, moving away from the more efficient oxidative pathways.
Is there a genetic interaction here too, making some individuals more susceptible?
Yes, absolutely. The review discusses findings where higher prenatal phthalates combined with a high genetic score for susceptibility to oxidative stress were associated with ASD risk.
So genes and environment interacting again.
Definitely. It suggests your genetic makeup influences how vulnerable you might be to a given exposure. There's also the idea that children with ASD might metabolize or eliminate toxicants differently, perhaps due to genetic or epigenetic reasons, leading to higher accumulation.
And for air pollution specifically, what's the suspected mechanism linking it to the brain?
Well, components of air pollution, like fine particulate matter or diesel exhaust particles, have been linked to ASD-like behaviors in animal models, potentially by interfering with prenatal immune signaling pathways like toll-like receptor 4, TLR4, and causing neuroinflammation, inflammation in the developing brain.
Inflammation again.
Seems to be a recurring theme, doesn't it? And heavy metals might also exert effects by impairing the body's antioxidant defenses, like the glutathione system. This is relevant because reduced antioxidant capacity has been found in some studies of individuals with ASD.
So multiple potential hits from these toxicants.
Yes, but the review is clear that research on toxicants and ASD is still relatively in its infancy compared to some other areas. Measuring exposure accurately is a major challenge.
How so?
While measuring levels in blood or urine gives you a snapshot of recent exposure, measuring accumulation in tissues like the brain or even using baby teeth can give a better picture of long-term prenatal exposure, but that's obviously much harder to do in large population studies.
Right. Okay, that is a huge amount of complex information, infections, metabolic conditions, medications, chemicals, all potentially influencing development through these possibly shared pathways like inflammation, mitochondria, gut health, hormones.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah. So given all this complexity, where does the review say the research needs to go next? What are the big challenges?
Well, the single biggest challenge highlighted is really bridging the gap.
Hmm.
Moving beyond just seeing associations in human population studies and seeing mechanisms in preclinical lab studies to really understanding the causal links in humans.
Making that definitive connection.
Exactly. And ASD's incredible diversity makes this super difficult. The different ways it presents clinically, its varied genetic underpinnings.
The heterogeneity.
Right. Add in all the potential confounding factors we've talked about and co-occurring conditions like anxiety or epilepsy, and you really see the scale of the challenge.
It sounds like researchers need more sophisticated tools and approaches.
Absolutely. The review really stresses the critical need for large, detailed, longitudinal birth cohort studies.
Meaning following kids over time.
Yes, following large groups of children right from before birth through childhood, collecting tons of detailed data along the way on exposures, health, development, everything. Robust clinical assessment or phenotyping is also crucial to capture that full spectrum of autistic traits accurately.
And integrating different kinds of biological data, like genetics,
Exactly.
microbiome.
Yes, exactly. Using multi-omic approaches, combining data from genomics, epigenomics, changes in gene expression, the microbiome, metabolomics, looking at all these layers together to get a much more complete picture of what's going on biologically.
They also mentioned the exposome approach. What's that?
Ah, yes, the exposome. That's a really interesting and important concept that's gaining traction in environmental health research.
What does it mean?
It essentially means looking at the totality of environmental exposures and individual experiences throughout their life, starting right from conception in the womb.
So not just looking at one chemical or one infection in isolation.
Precisely. It's about considering the cumulative impact of all the exposures, chemical, biological, social, nutritional, and how they interact with each other and with our own individual biology over time. It's a much broader, more integrated, more realistic view of environmental influence.
That sounds incredibly complex to measure, but probably much closer to reality.
Exactly. Other strategies mentioned include using advanced statistical methods like latent class analysis to try and identify specific subgroups within the broad autism spectrum that might help personalize research and eventually interventions.
Right.
And using genetic susceptibility scores, combining information from multiple genes, can help researchers understand who might be most vulnerable to particular environmental influences.
And preclinical studies, the animal models, they still have a role.
Oh, definitely. They remain vital for testing specific hypotheses about causality.
Yeah.
You can control the environment in a way you just can't with humans, allowing scientists to really probe those biological mechanisms and complement the human observational data.
So ultimately, what's the big picture goal driving all this incredibly complex research?
The driving goal really is to identify predictive biomarkers, early signs of risk, and most importantly, to find targets for early primary prevention.
Prevention.
Yes, by truly understanding how specific genes and specific environmental factors converge on these biological pathways to influence neurodevelopment, the hope is to find ways to intervene early, possibly even before birth, to support healthy development and reduce the likelihood of ASD developing in those who might be susceptible.
So what does all of this mean for you listening? This deep dive into the BMC Medicine Review really underscores that understanding ASD is incredibly complex. It's clearly not just about genetics, and it's not just about environment.
No, it's that dynamic, intricate dance between the two. And the prenatal period, the time in the womb, seems to be emerging as a particularly sensitive and critical window for these interactions.
Yeah, we've seen how these seemingly very different factors, like a mother having a severe infection or conditions related to diet and metabolism, like obesity or gestational diabetes,
Or exposures to common medications or environmental chemicals like phthalates and air pollution are all being investigated for potential links to ASD risk.
and the potential ways they might exert these effects are fascinating, right? Potentially disrupting these really fundamental biological pathways.
Mm.
Inflammation, how our cells make energy in the mitochondria, the balance of our crucial gut bacteria, and our hormonal systems.
The research is obviously full of challenges, teasing out those confounding factors like we discussed with SSRIs and antibiotics, and dealing with the huge variability within ASD itself, the heterogeneity. But the work being done to identify these potentially modifiable factors and the biological pathways they influence, that really does offer genuine hope for future prevention strategies.
It really moves the field forward towards a future where interventions could potentially be tailored, maybe based on a combination of someone's genetic susceptibility and their specific exposure risks.
And here's where it gets, I think, really interesting, bringing it back to that exposome idea you mentioned.
Yeah. Think about that again, the cumulative sum of all environmental exposures throughout life. starting right there in the womb. Now, this review did a great job focusing on specific known or suspected prenatal factors. But thinking about the full exposome, it raises a huge question, doesn't it?
What's that?
How might our understanding of ASD, and maybe even our ability to prevent it, change if we could truly map all the environmental inputs a developing fetus experiences? Not just the big ones we currently suspect, but everything. And understand how they all interact, not just with our genes, but with each other over the course of gestation. It's a much bigger, much more intricate puzzle than just looking at factors one by one.
That's a profound challenge, thinking about that totality of exposure and interaction, a truly holistic view.
Yeah, definitely something to think about. That wraps up this deep dive. Thanks so much for joining us.